My sisters and brothers, each year in the A cycle, we are, of course, on the 3-year lectionary. In the A cycle, the fourth Sunday of Lent is the Gospel of John with the man born blind. So we hear this Gospel at least every 3 years. It always falls, of course, on Laetare, or Refreshment Sunday, this point that we are slightly beyond our halfway point toward Easter. And it's intentionally a time that the Church puts forward, a time to be refreshed, renewed, and to start to be actively looking for Easter, which is coming up, getting ourselves ready for the Paschal celebrations, as you heard, of course, referenced in the opening prayer tonight. And it's in that context that we hear this event in the ministry of Jesus, where Jesus cures the man who was born blind. But one of the things that John also gives to us is the reactions of other people around him. We hear, of course, the man himself who was born blind. We hear the questions of his disciples. We hear the reaction of his parents. We hear the reaction of other people in the synagogue. We hear the reaction of those who were there at the time. And John then invites us to ask ourselves, which one are we? Which one do we identify with? And how do we respond? It's not an idle question, because at different times in our life, we've probably been all of them. There are probably times when we were the one who was born blind. There are times we've probably been his parents. There are probably times we were the Pharisees. There might even have been times when we ourselves helped another to see as Jesus does. And so this is a gospel that allows us to look at ourselves as we are going through this Lenten journey and to ask ourselves, what do we see? What do we see God doing? And what is our reaction when God acts in a way that is surprising or not according to our expectation? Do we rejoice? Do we allow God to touch and open our eyes? Or do we say that this one was born totally in sin? Again, if we're honest with ourselves, we've probably had more than one occasion when we did not like who God was acting through or the way in which God was acting. And that's why during Lent this gospel challenges us to see differently and to be allowing ourselves to be converted in what we see and where it is we see God's action taking place in our lives and in the lives of others. One of the things that we hear in this gospel is this understanding of the man born blind. And the fathers of the church point out to us in this gospel that the man's sight is not all that is given. Miracle, of course, though that is. It is also the understanding of who Jesus is also given to him. And we hear that when the gospel says to us, "Who do you believe in the Son of Man?" And the man responds, "Who is he that I may believe?" Jesus says, "It is I," and the man worships him. We tend to jump over that verb, he worshipped him, but it's central to the man's experience. The fathers of the church point out that not only did he see with his eyes, with the eyes of faith, he also understood that Jesus was the presence of the divine, that in the miracle of the incarnation, God had drawn close to him, and he could see and know that. And so we see not only the miracle of his sight being restored, we see also the miracle of him understanding who Jesus is and what God was doing in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of Man. But we also know that was not without controversy. We hear some who are upset because he healed him on a Sabbath, and so said he must be a sinner. We hear his parents afraid to celebrate God's mercy, and they say instead, he is of age, ask him, because they were afraid of the people they went to synagogue with, and were afraid that they would be thrown out. We hear those who say, we know that Moses spoke to God. We don't know where this one came from. My sisters and brothers, part of what Lent is about is to challenge us to see and to live differently, to allow God to surprise us with where and how and through whom God is acting to change and challenge our lives, so that we might be more able to see what God is doing in our world, in our lives, and in our communities. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that the evangelist probably skipped over some of the things that were said in real life and cleaned up the language for public radio. But how often do we hear some of those same kinds of things in social media and popular media today? They're sinners. They're wrong. They're traitors. They're evil. They're fill in the blank. Anyone ever hear that on TV or on Facebook? And what's our excuse? They're fill in the blank. And we're not fill in the blank. Sound familiar? Part of what Jesus challenges the synagogue of believers, the people that were gathered there to do, was to see, literally, what God was doing through him for this man who had been born blind. And rather than rejoicing in God's mercy, they accused the one who was healed, and they accused Jesus of being sinners, and the man himself being born totally in sin. My sisters and brothers, part of our challenge as a believing community is not only to see and look around, but to see in the same way as Christ does, to allow God to touch our eyes and to open them with the light of faith. Not so that we can be afraid of what we see, but rather so that we can see more fully and more accurately, and with the man who was born blind, not only come to see the Son of Man, but come to see who he is as well. A great deal of our challenge, I would suggest to you, my sisters and brothers, during Lent, as we are looking and being challenged by our God to confront our sinfulness, those times and places we have failed, is to avoid talking about everybody else's sin. Did you notice that the only sin they talked about was somebody else's? They who are disciples of Moses, we don't know where this one came from. We are followers of the law. You were born totally in sin. Part of the challenge that we receive from John, my sisters and brothers, is to allow God to open our eyes and rejoice at God's mercy for us, but also God's mercy for others. Throughout Lent, we are preparing to draw near to Easter and to the Easter celebrations. And in fact, we, of course, ourselves are looking with devout expectation to see the empty tomb, to see the miracle of the resurrection, to see once again God's promise to us to bring us to new life, to change our lives, to bring us to everlasting life. But in the meantime, what are we seeing during this Lenten time? Do we see places where God is acting that are not of our choosing? Do we see God acting in the lives of people that we don't think deserve it? And the answer is, if we're honest with ourselves, probably yes. And that's why we're challenged to see and to celebrate the surprising works of God and the mercy that He is showing in unexpected places, through unexpected people, and in unexpected encounters. The man who is born blind asks the Pharisees, "Do you wish to be his disciple as well?" And as we know, they reject that invitation. Their eyes are not opened. They choose not to see. Jesus says, if you had been blind, there would be no sin. But you say, I have no sin, so your sin remains. My sisters and brothers, throughout Lent, as we are preparing for Easter, as we are preparing to see God's action anew that brings us life and eternal life and new life, we have to also allow our God to change our vision, to be surprised by what we see, and not afraid of what God is doing, not afraid of the action of God in surprising people and surprising places that will change how we see what God is doing and will change how we see our world. This gospel, my sisters and brothers, on Laetare Sunday, Refreshment Sunday, is intended to refresh our eyes, to help us be attentive and actively looking for the mercy and the miracles that God is bringing into our world. Just not necessarily the ones we expect to see. But if we allow God to act in our world, if we, like the disciples, allow ourselves to see what Jesus is doing and to be surprised by it, perhaps we too will have the courage to see something different about ourselves, about those who are around us, about those we did not expect to see among us, and to celebrate with them the goodness and the graciousness of our loving God.